past Jefferson's second term. Okay, so it leads us to the election of 1804, where Jefferson is running for re-election. Now, despite the political partisan politics of Federalist versus Democratic relations, Jefferson really was very, very popular. I don't want to say that all the Federalists supported him, but I mean, when you look at what he had accomplished, there had been Louisiana Purchase. The Navy had been rather successful in dealing with the Barbary Coast pirates. There were certain accomplishments that, even if you didn't support the Democratic Republicans, it would allow you to support Jefferson. And so what you're seeing is that Jefferson really is extremely popular. He runs for re-election in 1804, and he wins in a landslide. I mean, he pretty much, again, has really no competition. And it's not like in his first election where he actually tied with his vice presidential nominee. This time it's pretty solid in the Electoral College for Jefferson. Not unanimous, but pretty solid Jefferson. But his second term is going to have a different focus. His second term will have a lot more focus on international relations, particularly because of what is happening in Europe. And what is happening in Europe are what we call the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon has, as I said in the last lecture, great dreams for France. He has dreams of a French empire and is basically taking his French army all the way up to Russia. I mean, invading lands. And the British vowed to put a stop to Napoleon and to the French Empire. And you have pretty much a very, very almost world war, but it's a huge war happening between the British and the French. And how does that affect the U.S.? Well, Great Britain has banned any neutral vessel from trading with France. We are a neutral vessel. We are not involved in this war. We are neutral. And so Great Britain has said if you trade with France, there are repercussions. So they have banned all neutral vessels. France, on the other hand, has threatened that all foreign ships that are trading with the British Navy will be attacked. And we go back to the alliance we had with France, the fact that France had been our first country to recognize our independence. There's a feeling for the French Revolution in the past. I mean, there's all these ties to France. And then again, remember, there was ties to Great Britain as well. They were our largest trading partner. So what do we do? I mean, it's almost back to the same question back that we had under Washington and Adams. What do we do? So Jefferson is trying to figure out a way that will keep us out of war. He doesn't want, in many ways, kind of like following Washington, doesn't want to show partiality to anybody, even though his natural tendencies and leanings would have been to France. He's still trying to keep the U.S. above all this. And he comes up with a very different idea. Some people might actually call it ingenious. It was something that was new. It was something that had never really been tried. And he says, sometimes the power of the money belt, the money, show me the money type of thing, right? Sometimes that's more powerful than strong military vessels and attack and war. And so what he comes up with is this idea of an embargo act. It's called economic diplomacy. In the United States, to this day, since Jefferson has used it on various countries, but the United States of 2020 is very different from the United States of 1807. So, what happened? I'll give you a little background. It all kind of begins, we realize we have serious issues with both countries, but also with Great Britain. And we have what is called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. In June 1807, off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, we had HMS, or Great Britain's Royal Navy, the Leopard, and the USS Chesapeake. The Leopard went after the Chesapeake, all under these ideas that the U.S. was violating neutrality. It was blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But, well, anyhow, make a long story short, the British attacked the USS Leopard. It was like a little battle. And the British continue to do what they have been doing for a while: impressing sailors that are American and putting them on the British naval ships. They actually board the USS Chesapeake and they impress 4 sailors. The Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, are obviously angry about this, but so are many other Americans. This is getting ridiculous, this impressment of sailors. And Jefferson is trying to avoid a war. So he does diplomatically try to negotiate with Great Britain, at least have Great Britain show some remorse. And Great Britain does not show any remorse. And in fact, Great Britain reaffirms that they will continue to impress these sailors because they believe these sailors are British sailors, and don't trade with France. On December 22nd, 1807, Jefferson basically says money is going to hurt the British. They are a number one trading partner, and it will hurt the French more than actually engaging in war. Commercial warfare, if you want to call it. And so what he says or declares is the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act basically said the United States will not trade with France and will not trade with Great Britain. What they're saying is, you all do it on your own. We're not going to trade with either of you. In a way, it's punishing Great Britain for the impressment of sailors. It's punishing France for attacking us when we did trade with Great Britain. And they're hoping it's going to stop both countries from attacking American shipping. And really teach both Britain and France to respect U.S. neutrality. And hope that Great Britain will be pressured into stopping impressment of sailors. So think about it. We, this very young country, because we are young, has decided we're not going to trade with really 2 of the greatest powers in the world. Great Britain, probably the biggest power in the world at the time, and France following arguably a close second behind. Little US, it's kind of big if you think about how physically it's big, but it's still very young US, up against Great Britain and France. No trading with you all. You all are going to pay. You're going to suffer because we're not trading with you. Very unique, very creative. Unfortunately, the US did not have the economic strength, the economic power to really deliver a punch on the French and the British economy. France and Great Britain are world powers. They have colonies all over the world. Great Britain, so it doesn't buy US goods. They have colonies all over the world. They'll get agricultural products. They'll get whatever it is that they need from other colonies, and they'll trade with other countries. They are or were our biggest trading partner, but they don't need us. We need them. France, it's kind of the same. We traded a lot with them, but France doesn't need us. What they need, they can get from other countries. This Embargo Act, which pretty ingenious, is disastrous for the United States economy. And within 15 months, on March 1st, 1809, it is repealed. These are actually in the last days of Jefferson's presidency. It was disastrous, though. Today, If the United States were to put an embargo on a country, they will not trade with this country. 9 times out of 10, I would argue that that embargo is going to bring disaster to that country's economy because the United States economically is a powerhouse. We had an embargo act against Cuba that started back in the 60s after the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban economy has never recovered from that. We have had embargo acts and trade embargoes against various countries, and this embargo of trade with certain countries has proved very effective, and it puts a lot of pressure on a country. But we are very different from what the United States was in 1807. In 1807, it's almost like, great idea, Jefferson, but it hurt us. We needed those countries more than they needed us, and it was disaster. However, in 1808, in the new election year, which Jefferson actually again was asked, will you run 3 terms? And Jefferson's like, no, no, no. He's still very popular despite the Embargo Act. People still have a very special fondness for Jefferson. And Jefferson's like, wait a minute, no, I'm not going to run again. Look at Washington. He stepped back 2 terms. I'm going to follow the same. And he does. But because he is so popular still, he is almost able to handpick his successor. All he has to do is give his endorsement. All he has to say is, I really believe that so-and-so would be the best president to follow me. And people would overwhelmingly, because of Jefferson's popularity, vote for his handpicked candidate. Who did he endorse? Who did he handpick, if you want to think about it that way? Well, mini-me, Secretary of State James Madison from Virginia, a Democratic Republican, and much, if you want to think about it this way, the protege of Jefferson, someone that had studied extensively Jefferson's works and ideas and theories from Virginia, as I said. And remember, Madison isn't just a mini-me of Jefferson. He is the father of the U.S. Constitution. He is also, he will be elected the fourth president of the United States, but he is also part of the Virginia monopoly. From Virginia, one of the 4 out of the first 5 that are presidents, and from Virginia. He also has the distinction of being the shortest shortest president at 5'2". And I would refrain from any short jokes because I am 5'2". So he's just under tall. That's all. But if you think about it, think of the height of Washington and Jefferson. Yeah, Madison comes in kind of like mini-me. Anyhow, the 4th president of the United States from Virginia, who serves from 1809 to 1817, he will be elected to 2 terms. And he, like Jefferson, is a Democratic Republican. And like Jefferson, follows very much many of his ideas. The same ideas of strict interpretation of the Constitution, limited federal government, more states' rights. And also, like Jefferson, things seem to kind of contradict what some of those ideals are. Initially, Madison becomes president and has to really deal with problems that Jefferson had been having, which were the international problems between Great Britain and France. He also had to deal with the fact that Great Britain had this impressment policy. And there are some other problems that he's inheriting from Jefferson that I hadn't really touched on. And that is some problems on the frontier. We are starting to see increasing Native American attacks on the U.S. frontier, on the Western territories. What is happening? Well, for one, as the U.S. pushes further and further west, going towards the Mississippi River, for example, Native Americans that have been living on these lands are pushing back. I mean, that is to be expected. They are fighting for their homelands. But there is something else going on, and people are starting to feel that Great Britain is behind some of these attacks. attacks, that they may be supporting them, organizing them, at the very minimum, trading with Native Americans and giving them guns and supplies, which are then used on Americans on the frontier. This is becoming a big deal. Are the English instigating this? As we hear more and more about these frontier issues, and as we find more and more evidence of these English arms that are being used, and talk that some of these Native American tribes that are attacking may be coming from Canada. Canada was kind of the refuge area where many of the Native Americans, after the War of Independence that had been allied with the British in that area, had actually moved to. Well, now it felt like they were coming down from Canada. Whether or not the British actually had an official policy to attack on the frontier using Native Americans, it's been debatable. But one thing that we do know as a fact is that a growing anti-British sentiment was increasing in the United States. Tecumseh was a Native American chief who had a dream, which is a very interesting goal he wanted. It was a goal of Pan-American or Native American alliance, crossing across nations and tribes. He was hoping to unite these various nations and tribes against the Americans on the frontier, protect Native American tribal lands, and he was one of the organizing chiefs of these attacks on many of the frontier settlements. He will eventually be stopped in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he ends up falling to General William H. Harrison. But was Tecumseh getting British support? Were they using British arms, British guns? Yes, some of them were. But again, was it all organized from the British, or did the British take advantage of the anti-American sentiment that these Native Americans had? Or was it all just a weird coincidence? Probably not just a coincidence. There was probably a little more to it, but was it official policy from the British? No. But that doesn't change the relations that are souring with Great Britain. The British are continuing to attack American ships, those impressing of sailors, saying that those sailors are British. They board American ships, and then they're putting them on British ships. Was Tecumseh and other Native Americans being supported by the British? People were thinking they were. And there is this growing anti-British sentiment. In fact, there was a group in Congress that were known as the War Hawks that wanted war with England now. The leaders of the War Hawks were a Kentucky representative, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Please highlight these two names. We'll be hearing a lot about them in the next lectures. A lot. Anyhow, these War Hawks, which really wanted war against England, said the embargo had not worked. War was really the only thing that Britain would actually understand. And there was a lot at stake here, not only our frontier, but our honor, our integrity, and our national security. Here is Henry Clay on the left, Calhoun on the right. Henry Clay again from Kentucky, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. James Madison was under a lot of pressure from his own party, a lot of pressure from Congress, a lot of pressure from the British. the British weren't stopping these actions. They continued to impress the sailors. They continued to be supporting those Native American hostilities, and they were violating our neutrality. Now, some conspiracy theorists have argued that maybe the US had intentions of Canada and they were interested in maybe taking some lands in Canada. I kind of, I mean, I don't think that it was an ultimate goal of any kind, but there's always conspiracy theories. But because of all this pressure that's on June 18th, 1812, he had asked Congress for a declaration of war. Remember, the president can't actually declare war. Congress has to, and it was given. On June 18th, 1812, the United States formally declared war for the second time against Great Britain. The War of 1812. Now, some people call the War of 1812 the Second War of Independence. And the reason they do this is because, in many ways, they might be right. Certain issues that had not been resolved are finally going to be resolved with this war. Everything from forts, questionable forts on U.S. territory, the U.S. meddling in the domestic affairs like Native Americans within the United States, and really kind of formally breaking maybe little remnants that we may have had of an umbilical cord still attached to Great Britain. But I want you all to realize, again, we're going up against the biggest power in the world. Anyhow, the United States will ally itself with various Native American tribes, the Choctaws, the Cherokees, the Creeks. Again, highlight these names. We'll hear from them again. And the British will ally also with some Native American nations, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, the Fox, the Creek Red Sticks, the Sauk, the Kickapoo, and various other nations. And we'll be fighting this war on the ocean. We'll be fighting this war on the East Coast. We'll be fighting it on the frontier and in the Western lands in areas like Louisiana. The War of 1812 had three principal theaters. So that's kind of three areas that we were seeing the major part of the fighting. There will be the war on the ocean, both on the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. There is going to be the war between the U.S. and Great Britain, but fought kind of on the U.S.-Canadian border. Remember, Canada to our north was a British colony. And we will have the war being fought down in the south, around the New Orleans area and the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And in reality, when you look at these three theaters, who was ahead? Kind of, it went back and forth. On the sea, the British blockaded our Atlantic East Coast ports. And then, unfortunately, by 1814, when they had ended their war with France, they were able to send 14,000 reinforcements over to the Atlantic coast, especially the Chesapeake Bay region. They'll invade it. On the U.S.-Canadian border, you had advancements where the U.S. tried to go north. They were unsuccessful with that. Various times the British were coming down south, but it just was kind of back and forth. And then down in the Gulf Coast, after, again, by 1814, after England has beaten France, they are able to refocus on this American war front, and they, again, will start sending more ships and more troops down to the south, particularly the port of New Orleans. On August 1814, the British invade the Chesapeake Bay region. And they will, as they invade the coast of the Chesapeake Bay region, will kind of go up north and march towards Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. On August 14th, 1814, the British will burn Washington, D.C. It is the only time that an official foreign government has invaded the U.S. Capitol. The White House was burned, or the president's house was burned. Buildings were burned. I mean, this was talk about symbolic gesture. It was huge. It was a very big hit to the heart. As the president's home was being burned, Dolly Madison, the first lady of the country, James Madison's wife, actually is going to save some of the paintings that to this day the nation is still very grateful. George Washington did not sit for many official portraits. There are really only 3 portraits that he sat for as president. And she was able to save these paintings, the ones that were actually in the president's house. So we are very thankful to her for saving those paintings, as well as some other very important parts of our U.S. history. From Washington, D.C., continuing around north, going around the Chesapeake Bay region, the British are marching on to Maryland and are planning to attack Fort McHenry, which is just off in the Bay of Baltimore, Maryland. So they're going up into Baltimore and hoping to attack Fort McHenry. The British are going to bombard Fort McHenry all night. And obviously bombarding Baltimore also in the process. And as you can see from this painting, it's just all night, bombs or rockets glaring red as they are attacking. Many of the city inhabitants, for their own safety, had actually escaped and were on ships in the harbor, in the just off the coast, watching this battle. And through the night, I heard the bombs, saw the rockets, saw the attack, and many of them believed that as the morning came, that over Fort McHenry there would be a British flag, not the U.S. flag over it. One of these inhabitants, happening to be out in watching all this, was a poet by the name of Francis Scott Key. And to his amazement, he woke up the next morning, and waving in the sunrise was not the British flag, but the American flag, still standing, battered, charred, burned, but still standing over Fort McHenry. He was inspired to write a poem called The Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so greatly we held the twilight? Oh, sorry, I can't read too well. What so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous night over the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave over over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Many years later, we added music to that, and it became our national anthem. And if I go back right here, this is the actual flag that flew over Fort McHenry. You can see it at the Smithsonian. They have a special place for it. It's in its room all by itself. The actual flag that still survives that flew over Fort McHenry during the battle. So, what is happening though as far as the war? Well, by December 1814, there wasn't like a clear-cut winner. There wasn't any major decisive battle. Yes, our capital was burned, but it wasn't like big generals had been captured. It wasn't like the Battle of Yorktown, where very decisive battle victories had happened. And trade was being hurt dramatically. Obviously, the US, our biggest trading partner, was Great Britain, but the merchants of Great Britain were like, wait a minute, we just need to get back to normality. And so there had already been negotiations, committees had been put together to try to organize a peace treaty between Great Britain and the United States. And on December 24th, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent, Ghent is in Belgium, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Really nothing exceptional about the treaty. It basically, in essence, just formalized peace. But it is a peace that since has been established between Great Britain, and one could very well present a very big argument to this day that Great Britain and England is our greatest ally. It solidified Anglo-American relations, and a tie that some people have always called the special tie or special relationship. But look at the date. December 24th, 1814 is when the Treaty of Ghent is signed. News takes a while. Remember, at least a month to get over to the Americas that the war is over. They've signed a peace treaty. It just needs to be ratified by the Senate. In the meantime, on January 8th, 1815, well, huge battle's going to happen. The British down in the Gulf of Mexico are going to invade the port of New Orleans. Their goal is to capture New Orleans and capture the southern part of the Mississippi River, and if they can, take all of Louisiana. U.S. General Andrew Jackson, aided by a pirate, Jean Lafitte, are going to organize a massive defense for New Orleans and the surrounding areas. And it's a huge victory for the United States. The British have to order all their troops out of southern Louisiana and out of all these territories. They are humiliated in victory, humiliated in their defeat. It's huge. This is a major decisive battle. Here, famous painting from the Battle of New Orleans, and you have Andrew Jackson always aboard. He's always depicted riding a big white horse, a stallion, and always leading his men, or on top of a hill leading his men. And the Battle of New Orleans, huge, huge victory. Here is a more modern photo of New Orleans. This is Jackson Square, which is right kind of in the middle of New Orleans in what is known as the French Quarter, or Old New Orleans, Louisiana. And in the middle of that square, there is Jackson aboard a horse looking over the Mississippi River and celebrating, obviously, the victory he had. We'll be talking a lot about Andrew Jackson next lecture. Anyhow, what are the results of that very, very decisive victory, the Battle of New Orleans? Well, all of a sudden, we have a new national hero, Andrew Jackson. I mean, he's George Washington again. I mean, we adore him. We're like, oh my gosh. And he's also, though, kind of one of these man of the people. He is self-made. He came not from any kind of inherited wealth. He becomes one of the more prominent plantation owners in Tennessee, but he didn't start off that way. And so he's kind of like Jefferson's idea of from the farming, this noble farmer will arise. He's a military hero like George Washington. He's kind of Jefferson and Washington combined. People can't get enough of Andrew Jackson. He's one of them, but he's also kind of a very big hero. He is the big guy in the United States now, and we are enthralled with Andrew Jackson. The second thing that comes out of the Battle of New Orleans is that for many, they hear of this battle first, I remember the date, early January 1815. The treaty has just been signed on December 24th, 1814. But because the battle was in the United States, it's probably going to be the news that they hear first. And then they're going to hear of the treaty. The war is over. The perception is the United States won the war. Andrew, I was going to say George Jackson, but it's Andrew Jackson beat the English. We won the war because of him. We won the war. We beat England a second time. Whether or not that's actual fact really becomes irrelevant to the population, because Treaty of Ghent, as far as they're concerned, happened after the Battle of New Orleans. And we are excited, patriotic, united, like we hadn't been united since Washington. There was a little blip during the war. There were some critics of the war. People that felt Madison had overstepped. He should have never called for this war. In fact, many people called it Madison's War. And pretty much it came from the Federalists. And towards 1814 and 1815, and remember, again, all this is happening while treaties are being negotiated, battles are being fought. This isn't the era of fast communication. But in Hartford, Connecticut, a group of Federalists from New England are going to get together because they want to discuss this war. They are against it. Remember, Federalists tend to be pro-British. They are against this war. They are against Madison's power. They feel that he has increased the presidential power and has increased federal power, and they're concerned about this. And you have a group of very radical Federalists that are meeting up with some more conservative or moderate Federalists, and they come up with an idea. They didn't approve of Madison's war, as they called it, and they come up with a theory known as the doctrine of secession. Now, this doctrine of secession builds upon what Jefferson and Madison had proposed in those Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, this doctrine of nullification, doctrine of states' rights. What the doctrine of secession suggests is that states have these powers, these states' powers. They voluntarily joined a union. Here they're talking about Connecticut and their New England states. They had voluntarily joined this union. And states then not only could nullify federal laws, but more than that, if the states didn't agree with the course that the federal government was taking, that the United States was taking, the states could secede. Because they were individual states that had voluntarily joined this union, they could voluntarily leave this union. Secede, leave. The doctrine of secession. What happened after the Hartford Convention? Was it taken into effect? Well, no, not in 1815. The war ended. The Federalists are disgraced because they had been kind of anti this war, and they're kind of seen as traitors because they're like, oh my gosh, you were against this war and we won. Jackson, look, we have a new hero, Andrew Jackson. Look at the Battle of New Orleans. We won. Did we not? The war's over. We have a peace treaty. The Federalists are now kind of seen as unpatriotic. How dare they go against us in this war? And they kind of cease becoming a major party. Now we kind of have only one party, the Democratic Republicans. But before I go any further with this one party, I want you all to see what I just talked about. Doctrine of secession. These Federalists have opened up that Pandora's box even further. because that idea, this doctrine of secession, will be the very theory that is going to be used when Lincoln gets elected and South Carolina and 10 other states agree to secede from the United States. Jefferson firmly believed that he had opened up a Pandora's box when he did the Kentucky and Virginia, and he and Madison did the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And what we're seeing is that people keep on building on it. Even though no actions are being taken on it, they keep building on that theory. Anyhow, a great political cartoon. I'll give you all a few minutes to take a look at it. It's about the Hartford Convention and how they're kind of taking these ideas that Madison had acted very much like a king, and that they had thought about dissolving or leaving the Union, and just basically a political cartoon arguing or criticizing the Federalists for what they did. But after the war, after everybody hears about New Orleans and then they find out that the war is over, I mean, it's just like a whole new period begins. Now, remember, this is still part of the Jeffersonian democracy, but between 1815 to 1824, that little subset called the Era of Good Feelings just is about intense pride, intense love, intense red, white, and blue, because we just won the second war against Great Britain. And what are the characteristics of this era of good feelings? For one, unity. And we're going to see this unity reflected in many ways. First of all, we're going to see one party. The Democratic Republicans, now just being called the Republicans. The Federalists, because of not supporting the war and because of what happened in Hartford, the Federalists just kind of ceased being anything important. So think about it. All those ex-Federalists, where are they going to go? They're going to start joining the Democratic Republicans. Something might happen there. Anyhow, you have one party. You're going to have that one party, that intense unity going to be reflected in politics. You're going to have it reflected in the economy. We're going to have one economic plan. It's going to be reflected in our international relations. We're going to have kind of one plan for our international politics. It's going to be reflected in the Supreme Court, with at least 3 Supreme Court cases really talking about intense federal power. And 1816 is an election year. Madison says, I do 2 terms. I finish my 2 terms. I'm out of here. And these Republicans are still very popular. And James Monroe is selected to run for the presidency. He wins in 1860. And just like Madison, just like Jefferson, just like Washington, he's from Virginia also. And he had also been a Secretary of State. He had been the Secretary of State for James Madison. And just like Jefferson and Madison, he follows the same ideas. And you add to that this feeling of great feelings. The other interesting thing about James Monroe is that Monroe is really the last of our founding fathers. I'm not saying that he's the last of the founding fathers, and after him, he's the only one alive. That's not what I'm saying. He's the last of the founding fathers to be president. He is one of the founding fathers. His name will be seen on various documents. He was in various committees. He has been very actively involved in establishing the young United States. But after him, you kind of see a new generation begin. John Quincy Adams, who was not a founding father, he's the son of a founding father, will be the next president. So James Monroe is the last of the founding fathers. So when we talk about this intense national unity, intense nationalism, focus on the United States, intense pride, we really have to talk about this very unique scenario where there's only one political party. The Federalists disappeared. They were seen as traitors. They were seen as un-American. They were seen as just kind of irrelevant because they hadn't really been supportive of Madison in the War of 1812. And so Jefferson's party becomes the dominant party. And they're now known as the Republicans. By 1820, the Federalists were basically dead. They didn't even offer a nominee for the presidency. This era gets its name from the fact that when James Monroe won the presidency, he kind of took a tour of the country, and he wanted to usher in what he said the good feelings. The name stuck, the era of good feelings. But what's really interesting, we have this one party dominating everything, but like I said, some of these old Federalists, where do they go? So they kind of join up with the Democratic Republicans, and everything under the guise unity for the United States, everything for the United States, rah, rah, patriotism. What you start seeing are policies, issues, actions that the Republicans support that kind of blur now the old party lines. Like you start seeing the Republicans talk a lot about a strong economy, a diversified economy. You start seeing the Republicans talking about a stronger federal government. These weren't traditionally Jefferson's ideas. You start seeing the Republicans talk about tariffs. The Democratic Republicans had never really supported tariffs. These are all ideas that are more federalist. But since everything is about pro-US, one economic plan, one foreign policy, one everything, those party issues are starting to blur. Even to the point that the Republicans are going to support a national bank to be reorganized. National bank. The irony of that. So when we look at the era of good feelings, one of the characteristics we talked about is one political party. The other characteristic is about one economic system, one strong, coming from Washington type of economic organization. And this system is called the American system. It was proposed by Henry Clay, representative from Kentucky. And what Henry Clay is going to put together in this plan are economic measures that are about promoting and strengthening the U.S. economy. Kind of like Hamilton's old ideas. And Henry Clay is like, I am going to use this feeling of era of good feelings, and I'm going to push this through because we're all united. We're all one USA. We're all one party. It's all unipartisan. He appeals to the national pride from the north to the south. It goes over sectional interests, and he's able to pass most of his program. Kind of like Hamilton's financial plan, there was one little issue that was a bit controversial. So what are the points of the American system? The first was that Henry Clay proposes that we should increase tariffs, higher tariffs. Tariffs, again, just to repeat, is a tax on imported goods. And so Henry Clay suggests that these tariffs will be good, not only we increase revenue in the United States Treasury, but it protects American manufacturing. It protects American industry. It promotes people to buy American because they don't have to pay a tariff on an American good. So it's a pro-business incentive to increase American trade and industry. Little note here, and it's not on the PowerPoint, so you may want to add it to your notes. Southerners had not been supportive of tariffs. They found that tariffs did kind of two things. One, it hurt them when they are negotiating the trade of their agricultural product. Remember, the South has to export their goods. They have to sell their agriculture, their cash crops to other countries. So when there's a high tariff on France or English goods or any other country's goods, it hurt them when they tried to negotiate the selling price of their crop, because those countries want to argue and say, well, it's not fair. You all have a high tariff on our goods. Why should we buy your cotton, so to speak? The other thing that Southerners did not like about tariffs is that Southerners, because everything is focused on a cash crop, Southerners didn't develop a lot of industry, a lot of manufacturing. And so Southerners, for staple things, like they're going to be producing all the cotton, but the cloth is coming from the North. So they realize that they are very dependent on Northern goods. They have to buy Northern products. They have to buy Northern goods. Well, if the Northern manufacturing companies don't have a lot of competition from foreign goods, they can raise the prices on the Southerners. So Southerners didn't like it. They felt very inconvenienced. However, because this is the era of good feelings, because there is this trans-state, pan-state movement of nationalism and pride and unity, the Southerners kind of overlook the new tariff. They're kind of like, okay, we'll support it. We got your back, Henry Clay. And a new tariff is passed. It's called the Tariff of 1816. The next point of Henry Clay's American system is the establishment of a national bank. Same reasons. He says, like Hamilton, we need this kind of organization. It'll be the center of our economic system. It'll help balance and control the cash flow and yada, yada, yada. The same things that Hamilton had been arguing. This is not a Republican ideal originally. Well, is this the controversial point? No. It passes like that. In fact, it gets its new charter in 1860. The old National Bank had already closed. Its charter had died out. So, yeah, they got a new bank. It wasn't even a big debatable point. People are like, yeah, we get it. Era of good feelings. We're all united. We'll support it. The most controversial part was the third point of the American system. Henry Clay really thought that the federal government should put together what he felt was what we needed for a strong trade within our country, kind of going across state lines. He wanted to put together a national transportation system, everything from building kind of interstate roads that connected throughout the country to also putting together a canal system. And that way, this infrastructure, this transportation networks could be used to create more trade networks. This was considered the most controversial aspect. In 1817, Monroe vetoes this aspect. He really believed that federal funds shouldn't be used for this, that this was much more a state right, and it was up to the states for them to do this, and so therefore it really was unconstitutional. And what we see happening is that in many northern states following this, they immediately started initiating transportation networks, building and maintaining and improving the road networks that they have, and a canal system, the Erie Canal. Very, very important to northern trade. We're not seeing that develop in the South. Not in any degree compared to how it's happening in the North. South is focusing on their cash crop. They're going to be making a lot of money out of a new cash crop, cotton. In foreign policy, we're seeing the same thing. National unity around one incredible foreign policy. The Secretary of State for James Madison is John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, is pretty much the chief architect of every one of Monroe's declarations and policies. And there's some characteristics of this international foreign policy. It is bold, very focused on the US, nationalistic, it's very pro-US. It is very strong. And we're going to see it reflected really in two manifestations, in the Adams-Onis Treaty and in the Monroe Doctrine. The Adams-Onis Treaty, passed or signed in 1819, was between Spain and the United States. The issue, again, has to do around Florida. Georgia, on its border with Spanish Florida, had some issues. There were frequently attacks coming from Spanish Florida, particularly from Seminoles. Seminoles were Native Americans that inhabited a lot of northern Florida, particularly in swamp areas. And there was issues there. Various American troops had actually crossed into Spanish Florida trying to deal with the Seminoles and these attacks. And in fact, in 1818, General Andrew Jackson had actually crossed into Florida, Spanish Florida, and occupied the territory. Very much highly criticized, obviously, by the Spanish for doing this. And the Spanish, under a lot of pressure, thinking that maybe the United States was just going to take over Florida, want to immediately negotiate with the United States about what's going on. Another issue with the Georgia border with Spanish Florida had to do with runaway slaves. Many slaves actually would escape into northern Florida, hide among the Seminoles, hide in the swamps. And there was an issue, especially for slaveholding Georgia, this idea that they wanted to be able to go into Spanish Florida and capture their slaves. And in 1816, U.S. troops had actually crossed the border into Florida to go after runaway slaves. Luis de Onis, Spanish minister to the United States, is going to be the head Spanish diplomat, and Adams being the highest ranking American representative as they negotiate what is happening between Spain and the United States. Adams realizes that Spain is very uneasy. They realize that Spain feels threatened by the United States, but it's not a threat where they have a strong posture. It's a threat where they feel that they may lose Florida. The United States might actually come in and take it. Other things that were happening with Spain at the time is that there is a growing revolutionary movement among its colonies in the Americas. So Spain is kind of spread thin of what it has to focus on. And it is very fearful that they may have to engage in some kind of military conflict with the United States. So John Quincy Adams presses that. He takes advantage of that uneasiness. And the result is the Adams-Onis Treaty. The conflict very much avoided war with Spain, and Florida becomes part of the United States. There's basically the idea of selling Florida to the United States. Spain figured they were probably going to lose Florida to the United States by force. Might as well give it up now, at least for money. So what are the points of the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819? Spain cedes or gives by treaty Florida to the United States. The United States agrees, point 2, to settle U.S. claims against Spain that included a debt that totaled $5 million. 3, they established a border in the west with the Spanish far northern borderlands. Spain also agrees to relinquish any claim to lands north of California, Remember, guys, the Lewis and Clark expedition and what we talked about there. And the United States also formally relinquishes any kind of claims that they may have had on Texas, one of Spain's far northern border provinces. There had been some question about where the Louisiana Purchase went into, and some people had believed it went into what is considered Texas. So the U.S. says, no, we won't press that claim. This treaty was considered a great diplomatic victory for the United States and a great diplomatic victory for Adams. And it really increased American pride. And so what we say is that this is a great example of nationalism. It solidified our borders with Spain, and it showed a growing American power. I mean, Spain relinquishes claim to north of California. And here is what you see on this map, the results of the Adams-Onis Treaty. Florida, and right in here in this area, is also what had been considered Florida. So the United States now has full access to the northern Gulf of Mexico. And this border with Texas right in here is solidified. And a border of the far northern frontier of Spain is now organized. And then we have the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. This is huge. Throughout the 1800s, getting into the 18 teens and the 1820s, there are some very important, significant events that are happening. As I mentioned earlier, Spain is having trouble with its colonies in the Americas. Many of them are starting revolutions. There is a growing independence streak going on in Spain's America. And some of these countries are already winning their independence by 1823. One of the most significant was Mexico. In 1810, Mexico had started its revolution and inspired, again, by the American Revolution. And by 1821, it solidifies its independence. We identified with this revolutionary movement in the Americas. We felt very paternal over this. We felt we had inspired these revolutions. We felt that we had inspired the French Revolution, which was an ocean away. We very much felt we had inspired these revolutions of our American neighbors. We also saw it as future trade partners. These were our own neighbors in our hemisphere. We had much more in common in a way with them than we did with the European countries. Understanding all of this and this era of good feelings where we're very focused on unity, the United States is viewing these revolutionary movements and independence that is being gained by places like Mexico. And we wonder, what if Spain tries to get these countries again? What if England decides to recolonize something? What if the Europeans attempt to either take their countries back, or their ex-colonies, back, or recolonize? There is also concern up in the Northwest around the Alaska, Northern Pacific area, that the Russians are starting to bring down their claims into the Pacific coastline. Great Britain, kind of some background to this, had actually asked the United States, have you noticed all that's going on? And have you noticed what Russia's doing over there? Why don't we together put out a joint declaration to prevent all these perhaps recolonizing attempts? And Adams said, no, the United States doesn't piggy bank on you. In fact, it would be more candid, meaning more powerful, as well as more dignified, to avow our own principles, for us to state what we think and believe, than to come in like a cockboat. A cockboat was like a small rowboat in the wake of a British man of war. We're not some little thing. We can state our own policies. And that is what we did. The Monroe Doctrine, called the Monroe Doctrine because it is President Monroe that declares it, stated that the United States would be opposed to any further colonization in the Americas by any European power or any attempt of a European power to exert political influence in the Western Hemisphere, or also recapture previously recognized independent nations that had once been colonies. If they do this and they violate the Monroe Doctrine, they will have to deal with the United States. The United States will protect the Americas. Results of the Monroe Doctrine in this great cartoon. Uncle Sam here protecting the Western Hemisphere. The European countries looking at us evilly. It's a political cartoon, guys. Well, huge. I do want to say something about the Monroe Doctrine, and this is where we'll end today's lecture, but not over yet. The Monroe Doctrine for us was huge. I mean, this is a powerful statement. I'll go back here. We were so excited. We were so proud of our Monroe Doctrine. We thought, wow, Europe is really going to take notice now. Yeah, most European countries didn't even acknowledge it. They didn't even respond. It's kind of like when you put something on social media and you're like, everybody's going to be around it and is going to like it and it's going to be great. And no one responds. You're like, oh, man. Anyhow, we'll pick up with the era of good feelings on Tuesday. Class is over. Bye-bye. Oh, I know somebody asked me if I would put the slides up. Let me see. Let me think about it. I don't like to, but I may have to. Okay.